Hello, everybody. This is Rob Fredette with the podcast HODGEPOD, and welcome. I'm back for another episode. And joining me on HODGEPOD for this episode is Martha Burns, author of the novel Blind Eye. She can be found at marthaburnswriter.com on the internet. And she has been gracious enough to join me on my podcast for this episode to talk about her novel Blind Eye. And first of all, Martha Burns, welcome to HODGEPOD. I'm glad you're here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Thank you very much. So, always like to have my guests introduce themselves. Please talk about yourself before you wrote the book and your career, if you would, please.
Oh, okay. Well, it, I sometimes wonder if it's interesting to talk about myself as opposed to what book I wrote, but I'll try and make it interesting. I only became a writer a little bit later in life, and this book that we're going to talk about tonight, Blind Eye, I published in 2022. So I'm going back again and, trying to, publicize it and talk about it a little bit more. But I wasn't always a writer. I had an even more boring profession. A lot of people think of it as boring. I was a CPA and a tax accountant. So anyway, when I was lucky enough to be able to afford to go back to school, I told my husband, I came home one day and I said, I hated doing this stuff, this tax stuff. And we have two grown daughters and grandchildren and so forth. And the work as a CPA, it actually put me in proximity to a lot of really interesting people. So that worked out. And then I went back to graduate school, but my husband and I lived a lot of different places, but we were born and raised both of us in New Mexico. But as soon as we were old enough to get married, we took off and we lived in Hawaii. We lived in the Bay Area. We lived in Hawaii for a long time. We lived there twice. Then went to the Bay Area. Then we came back to New Mexico. Then we went to California again. And then we went to New Jersey. And I really loved living in New Jersey, actually. And then we lived in Switzerland. And so then when he retired, we moved back to New Mexico, southeastern New Mexico. That's where my book Blind Eye is set.
Mm-hmm.
That's where a lot of the inspiration came. And then I now live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I write full time. And I have another book that was published subsequent to Blind Eye. So that's kind of who I am.
That's interesting. So, I bet you're not missing tax season as it approaches, right?
No, I'm not. Actually, I don't even do my own income taxes anymore. I talked to my tax guy yesterday and rubbed it in a little bit and so forth. But I always like to say that I've forgotten everything I ever knew about tax. So, it's just gone. So
That's okay. Well, you got this new career, this new light. I've heard you on another interview say you're a storyteller. So talk about that if you would, please, because in order to write a book, I know it's probably hard work, but if you love it, it's not hard work.
yeah, and I do love it. And having kind of a writing life and knowing so many writers, I mean, I think we all have to love it. But I like stories and I'm a big talker, surprise. And I can even remember when I was a little kid, I had two sisters and a brother. And I remember I used to like hold them hostage to listen to them for they would listen to me tell them a story. But I know when I've got a good story to tell, you know, and until I have a good story to tell, it's really hard for me to have what it takes to sketch out a novel, especially a novel or even a short story. It has to mean something to me. But I do think of myself, first of all, as a storyteller. I, I like to give my readers not a lesson, and I write fiction exclusively, not any nonfiction, but I'm not trying to lecture them or teach them anything or even my style is not even a memoir or life experience. Instead, it's to give them an experience of some story, you
Hmm.
know, so that they could come away. Maybe they don't think about anything about the novel except that, oh, that was the story about such and such. That's, and I think I think for that kind of writing, it begins in place. It takes place someplace. Anyway, that's kind of like,
Interesting. So, what was the genesis of Blind Eye? When did you start thinking about it, and when did you start putting like probably pen to paper or start putting it on the computer?
Well, my husband and I moved back to New Mexico from New Jersey in 2007. And when we came, we didn't, I grew up in Albuquerque, which is kind of a big city now. It was a big city that I know it was a big town then. But anyway, where we moved was a rural area, ranching, rural, out in the, you know, in a ranching area.
Hmm.
And there was a story that was in the air at that time. I mean, people were talking about it. So I was inspired to write. I was already well into my writing career, but I kept hearing this story and talk about story, it was it was such a compelling story of an actual case. And so what Blind Eye is, I don't say it's based on this story, but it's inspired by the story. And it was a young boy, a 14-year-old boy, who murdered his family after years of abuse. And it was a story that is, I mean, it's a dark story, but I, so, as we got to know people well, my husband was from that part of the state anyway, so we knew a lot of people when we moved there, but people wanted to talk about it. It was as if they were suffering or damaged or traumatized by the story. And by the time we moved there, this boy had already gone to trial in the very community where we lived.
Hmm.
And so, everybody from the priest on Sunday morning mass was talking about it. It was a very much a story in the air. And then as I lived there, I was writing other things at the time and so forth. And as we continued to live, we lived there for about 15 years. And as I continued to live there, then I met some people that had known, I met someone who, there's the settings are all
Hmm.
they're not fictionalized, the settings are actualized. So I actually became friends was in a reading group and writing group with someone who had been the boys' third grade teacher in elementary school. So I I set out to write the book, and I didn't start writing it. This tells you how long for me writing takes. I started thinking about it in 2012.
Hmm.
And then I did a whole lot of research. And I in the interim I wrote something else and whatever, but I kept, I was just couldn't put this story away. So the first time I wrote the book, I wrote a manuscript the first time. It was what we call narrative nonfiction, kind of like In Cold Blood. But I'm not Truman Capote and I'm not a journalist. And I didn't want to put myself in the story. I could have set out to like interview people, but like I said, I'm not a journalist and I didn't really want anyone to tell me what I thought about the story. So my research was comprised of, and there was lots to dig into, newspaper reports, primarily in the beginning. But that first manuscript, it just didn't work. It just didn't have a coherent voice. So I set that aside. A couple of years later, I wrote it again. I wrote the manuscript again as a legal,
Mm.
because in the actual case, the boy did go to trial.
Hmm.
And I wanted my character to experience the same thing. And I thought what happened in New Mexico with this boy was very interesting, but still kind of timely. It's this isn't a one off. It's like, oh, this never has happened. This particular story is very unique to the community he lived in. But anyway, but I'm not an attorney. So that didn't work either. It really didn't have enough. I, Somebody else could have done a good job with that, who really knew the law better than I did. So I set it aside. And the third time I wrote it was The Charm. And I finally felt like I knew my way into the story. And that way into the story was to have the story told by, I mean, over 2 dozen point of view characters.
Hmm.
And when I first told publishers about that, they were like, you can't do that. You can't do that. But anyway, that's that is makes up Blind Eye. And so, and it's the story I tell is not about the murder, because even I've given that big reveal right at the beginning of our conversation, and a reader would pick up the book in like a bookstore or something like that, read the back of the book and so forth. And they would have first of all, they'd have no idea if they didn't know it already, that it was based on an actual case. But they would also, on the other hand, they would know that it was the story of a young boy who had murdered his family. So I'm not giving anything away, but so I didn't write a murder about the murders. I wrote about the community. So I've been talking a lot.
Yeah,
So
well, that's
anyway,
fascinating. That's
so I wrote about the community, and the reason why that was compelling to me is I was, even though I got there after the murders and after the trial, but just the year after the trial, I was part of that community. So I wanted to tell a story, not lecturing people, not trying to tell people this is what the community didn't do, but what we didn't do, and so the book was reviewed by your publisher will send your book off to Kirkus Reviews, and they'll do a review, and they're not hesitant to give a bad review. And so I got a very good review, but what they said was this bruising story is less a murder mystery than an unflinching look at a culture and community. And so that's what I was really, really, really pleased with that review. That and the fact that I tried to write, even though I'm a New Mexican born and raised here, I wasn't raised as, or in a ranching community and so forth. But I wanted to write a Western. I wanted to be somehow part of the genre of Western literature. So I'm very pleased. Again, I'm just like bragging, but Blind Eye won the Silver Spur Award for Contemporary Fiction in 2023. And so that puts me in the company of Silver Spur is the run up to the winner, but that puts me in the company of like Larry McMurtry or in contemporary fiction, or Craig Johnson, who writes great contemporary Western fiction. So anyway, those were my objectives, and maybe that's why it took me so long. I wanted to get the aspect of a young boy, 14 years old, living in a rural atmosphere and compelled to be part of the real ranching life. I mean, these were not rodeo ranchers. Well, they did rodeo too, but that they weren't rodeo ranchers in that. I mean, they raised livestock. They raised cattle primarily and sheep. And his dad, my Leland, and my character Leland's dad was a foreman of a big ranch. And that's where ultimately my Leland character killed his family. But he was the foreman, not the rancher, not the owner.
Well, Kirkus Reviews also said an engrossing crime tale that would make a lean and mean movie. So that was another review that they gave to it. So that's pretty awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, for so many people, I don't know where you're recording out of, Rob. I don't know, but for so many people, New Mexico holds kind of a mystique. And I think maybe every place does, but I think the location and so forth and makes it cinematic too, could make it cinematic.
Absolutely. I grew up in a small town in Massachusetts in New England, but I live in Memphis now. So it's I grew up in a small town and everybody knew everybody. So that was
Yes.
a small community. So I know, like you're mentioning New Mexico, the rural, everybody knows everybody and everybody knows what's going on in the town, whether
Right.
it's up or real, but everybody knows everything and everybody knows everybody. So is that pretty much the sense of?
That's what the sense is here. And because it's such a small community, and then they were additionally on ranches, and in my character's family moved from ranch to ranch. He couldn't really hold down a job with one ranch and so forth. At one point when the community is beginning to become worried about this boy in there on the last ranch he's at, where they're getting their information is from the UPS man, because he would make the delivery here. And so kind of, I think that's kind of the contemporary, contemporary version of, what years ago would have been the news would have traveled by, I don't know, but not Pony Express, but that the news traveled that way, and they would spread the news about, well, I pulled up to the Pruitt's ranch, and there's nobody there, and there's that kind of thing. So yeah, the community and the isolation that this young boy experiences his whole life in moving from ranch to ranch
Yeah.
is a big part of the story.
Yeah, the people congregate in New England. They congregate at coffee houses or Dunkin' Donuts, and they all
And
talk
yeah,
about the town stuff or high school football games or high school sporting events or movie theaters or restaurants. Word travels fast. I'm telling you, a small town,
right.
it really does.
And if you go back and look at, you've probably noticed this, you go back and look at American Lit, the story of the small town, it is ripe for being told. When I went back to school, I studied a lot of Faulkner, but only with people's help. And, he's telling kind of the same story in a lot of his stories, the story of the father and the son and this small community. And when the community kind of knows what's going on out there. And in my story, they turned a blind eye. So this collective voice kind of is interspersed in the novel, because
Mm-hmm.
early on they notice it, and then later there's just a really strong sense of guilt that they weren't able to stop it.
Mm-hmm. I've had you mentioned something earlier about it was like in your mind, it just didn't leave your mind. I've talked to other authors on my podcast, and it's the same thing. Something that's always on their mind when they're writing the book. It's something that they're always writing and always thinking about it, and it never goes away. And that's fascinating. When you ended the book, it must have been like, it was over, right?
And when I ended the book, I had a hard time giving it up because, I've been asked, well, what not only inspired you, but, who were you writing about and so forth. And I really took the responsibility. I took it seriously about writing about this boy because, and then when I left it, it was hard to leave him.
Hmm.
It was hard to leave him. And the, and I have always hoped, since I published it and since I thought about writing it too, I was always thinking this, I, I didn't want to write anything that was pandering to someone or taking his story. I've had people ask me if he read the book, if he would know it was about him, and absolutely 100%, whatever. So I did write about a real person.
That's fascinating. Also, Kate Nelson, the managing editor of New Mexico Magazine, said Burns crafts vividly compelling scenes that describe the danger of rural isolation and the laments of neighbors who too late regretted their own blind eye and collective failure to act. The blind eye, it's amazing. Like when things happen, people probably instead of acting, they get in their own silo or the horse blinders, and that like this is the perfect example.
Right. Yeah, it is. And I was really flattered by Kate's review. And I'll try and make this not too long of a story, but I remember once, as I was writing this back story, I remembered many years before when my children were little and I was at a Six Flags in New Jersey, and I was buying them tickets, and they were going to, it was a summer day and whatever. And there was a father and a son who came up to buy tickets, and then I don't think they ever did. And the boy did something to make the father mad. And it was, you know, 14-year-old, 12-year-old boys can be so tender and so dear, in my opinion. But he just said something to his father that made his father go into a rage. And he started berating the boy in front of, how people stand in front of a ticket area and so forth. And there were all these people around, including myself and including my daughters, who were just like, they were little and they were mortified by it. And the point is, I did nothing. And I can make all sorts of excuses. I'm a woman. My husband wasn't with me. I was alone. I didn't want to cause a problem with my daughters or upset my daughters. And this boy was just, there's just no other word for it. And I've never forgotten that. I've never, so as I was writing the novel, that sounds like a little thing, but that was my response. That was my response to something that just kind of lives with you. And I think that's what happened in this community to this day. The story has not gone away.
Mm-hmm. So talk about your writing style. I've spoken to a lot of authors as well, and the one word that they say is discipline. Discipline is the key. Are you disciplined, or do you write something down in the middle of the night, or how does that work when you put your book together?
Once I get an idea, I am disciplined. And I am consider myself a full-time writer, but I haven't always been since I started working on this. There were other things that daughters got married and that kind of thing. Other things and grandchildren are born. That's the important thing. But once I have an idea, I am very disciplined and set myself up. I think I think other people do this too, but I don't write at home. I've got a lovely little office that I can go to and so forth. But we have a coffee shop down the street that I could walk to if I wanted to, but I haven't recently. And I will go down there, get myself a cup of coffee, and it's noisy. There's people around, all sorts of people around. And a lot of the baristas know that I have a regular table, and I'll sit there for at least 2 hours. I know what I'm going to accomplish. I go and I accomplish it. It's something I can do. But I do a lot of my work there. I write in longhand, and then when I have a certain number of pages in what I'm working on right now. I'm working on another novel right now, and I'm kind of working in chapters, but they're kind of buckets. I don't know how they'll go together. But and I really believe for me, what works is to work with, other writers. About when we moved back to New Mexico from New Jersey, I thought, oh, my writing life's over. It's just, I'm not going to know any other writers. I'm not going to be able to do workshops or go to school or anything like that. But I immediately signed up to go to a writers conference in Taos. And I went not 4 years in a row, but I went 4 different times. And the first time I went, in the workshop I was in, I met two women. I loved their work. I stalked one of them until she would talk to me and so forth. But both of those, and that was in 2012. And I continued to work with them in differently. I work with one differently than the other, but one of them I am her first reader for everything she writes and vice versa. And what we do is we hold each other accountable. I trust everything she says and vice versa. And we keep each other writing. And anyway, that's been invaluable. And to trust other writers that they want the best from our writing and for theirs. So that's been really valuable to me.
So when you were writing Blind Eye, I've never asked this of an author. How do you know when a chapter is done to go on to the next chapter? How do you know like that chapter is final and then you move on to the next one, setting the scene on the next chapter? I've never asked that question.
Well, thank you that's a really good question. Do you write too? Because I think that,
I don't write, but I look at the process. I look at the details of stuff.
right.
I love the grind of like doing a podcast or talking to people about
Okay.
these
Okay.
writing. But how do you decide like, boom, this is it, and then you move on to the next chapter? Because it's pretty interesting.
Blind Eye was easier than some things I've written in that because I was so structured with it, with actual something that inspired me. I had a structure out there already. I couldn't figure out how to write it. I couldn't figure out how as a writer, the writer's voice to come into it, but I had a structure. And I learned when I went back to school and took a lot of creative writing courses and everything. I had one instructor in particular that used to tell me, this is a great, like a chapter. This would make a great short story, but you've got to find a way to make the reader want to read the next chapter.
Hmm.
So every chapter can't be so wrapped up that it's like, and that's what a short story tries to do. It likes to wrap it up, like one whole thing is told in a short story. So, you leave a short story and you think, wow, you know, that whole story is complete for you. So I had to learn how to not, because I don't write genre fiction and I admire people who do, like a mystery or something like that. So I wasn't leaving like something out in the air that they have to turn the next page, but there's got to be something compelling. But it was easier in this chapter, in this novel, I have to tell you, because I knew where the story went. What I'm working on right now, I I know where the story began, but I don't necessarily. It's a lot harder than it was in Blind Eye.
Mm.
Yes.
I've had some people that talk about movies. I've had directors on, and one thing I never figured out was like when you watch a movie. I know this is off topic, but the character actors, the fill-in actors there, and when you're watching a scene with people in a restaurant, they have to be so precise and make sure they're not part of the scene. And it's pretty interesting. Like they do a great job, and I wouldn't be good at it because I'd be looking at the main actors and wanting to see them. That's why
Yeah,
I love the
yeah.
process. Now, when I watch a movie, I watch the background actors. I watch the background
Oh,
actors.
do you? Yeah. You probably see a lot of snafus or something like that
I don't
too.
know. I just like the intricacies and the detail. I just
Yeah,
process. I think it's pretty. I mean, I'm not a writer. I do a podcast, but it's different. You have to do research and just put
right,
on a
right.
podcast. So the book can be purchased at Barnes and Noble, at indiebound.org, and Amazon. Of course, Amazon. How have the sales been for the book? It's been out 3 years, and maybe we can
Yeah.
produce it.
It it did pretty well. It did very well in New Mexico. Santa Fe has a rich kind of writing community and so forth. So I appeared at quite a few like bookstores and then the library and that kind of thing. But I jumped right away the minute I finished Blind Eye into the second novel. I I just I love it's so flattering to be able to talk about my book. It really is. But I love the writing. And so I didn't do as much as promotion as I should have or so now that my second book is out, I decided, okay, let's go back and see what we can do to promote it. And I also wrote a screenplay for adapted Blind Eye. So it's interesting what you say about movies, but during COVID, before I got a publisher for Blind Eye, I decided, well, I'm going to learn everything I can about screenwriting. And I wrote a screenplay for
Really?
Blind Eye. Really helped me. It really helped. Then I went back and made some changes to the novel before I sold it. So that whole exercise, it was fun to do it. It was fun. So
So, what was a typical day like when you were putting you were writing Blind Eye? I know you said you go to the coffee shop for a couple of hours. What was like a typical day when you were like in the middle of it?
right, right.
What was a typical day like? And you said, what did you get writer's block and get away
I
or?
and that's the other thing in this book. In this novel, I didn't get writer's block.
Hmm.
If I talked about blinding's writer's block, it's only when I'm trying to find a story to tell. And when I don't have a story to tell, then I am completely blocked. But once I have the story to tell, but on a typical day, it would kind of depend on where I was in the novel as to whether I was trying to do some research or whether I was actually sitting down. And so there's lots of different stages for me, and I call it kind of being in the zone. But when I'm writing, even the novel I'm writing right now or the second one, I I can be at the grocery store and I'm thinking about not the words, kind of the words are kind of there, but the scene. I can see the scene, like what you're saying with that you see the people on the periphery. I can see the scene. So I think, okay, I'm waiting for something or at a traffic light or something like that and say, okay, well, in this scene, and then it just happens. So, but a typical day for Blind Eye kind of changed as to whether or not I was doing research. I did so much research. In the actual case, the boy went to trial, and that was rich for me because once he went to trial, the trial was public record. And so I spent a lot of time at the Lincoln County Courthouse in Carrizosa, New Mexico, and they were more than generous. And again, they were anxious to talk about the story. And so that was probably around 2012 or something. And I obtained all of and there was, I mean, they're public. They made I had to pay for them, but they copied for me the whole transcript of the trial. I mean, like 300 pages of transcript that came from a court stenographer. They also not videotape, it's not video. They don't
Video?
have cameras in a courtroom in New Mexico, but they did audio. And so I had the whole audio. And they also, then they were able to share with me all sorts of evidence from the trial. And because the boy in the actual case pled not guilty, even though everyone knew he was guilty, his attorney was able to call to trial all of these people who testified on behalf of him. So the trial went on a long time, and I had access to all of that. So to go back to your original question, so it kind of did whether I was kind of in the research phase or the writing phase, but it really went together a lot of the time. So I listened to all of those tapes. I knew the boys. I never have met the boy. I've never met him in person, but I know his voice, and I know the way he spoke and his language and his dialect and so forth and all the townspeople. So I was trying to capture that on the page.
Mm-hmm. So talk about your next project. What's that consisting of?
Well, the project I'm working on right now and place is really important to me. So Blind Eye couldn't have taken place any other place in southeastern New Mexico. My second novel that came out was called Across the Narrows, and it takes place in Brooklyn, New York in the 1930s. So that was a certain place. What I'm working on right now takes place in Hawaii and I'm trying something different. It takes place in one summertime in 1985. And the core, what starts this, like I said, I always have to have a story. There was a young girl, 19-year-old girl, who went missing. And she was a dance instructor, taught jazz and hula. She was just one of those everything girls. And again, even though it was Oahu, Hawaii, it was a small community. She lived in a little community called Aiea, Hawaii, out near Pearl Harbor. And she left her dance studio one day and it was never seen again. And as the writer, I have access to knowledge that she was never found. But I'm writing about that summer when she goes missing and what the community's response was and what this one young couple that lives up at the top of a road called Halava Heights Road, which is across the street from a Marine Corps base, called Camp Smith. So I'm pulling all these stories together and then a backstory of Pearl Harbor and missing people and so forth. It's about people who go missing. That's about, so it's, I know how I'm trying to tell, unlike Blind Eye, I know how I'm telling the story. It's not as easy to go from one chapter to the next. Wow. But it's compressed time. Blind Eye has two storylines that come together. It's the storyline of 24 hours when the boy is missing. The boy goes missing after the murders, and the sheriff, this deputy, is called in to investigate the murders. So there's that 24-hour period, but then there's another timeline that goes from when the little boy, Maya Leland, is a toddler, and then it converges to the time when the murders are committed. So really, this story goes over, he was 14 when the murders were committed, 16 when he went to trial. So over a 16-year period. So this new novel is another challenge for, how to write about a short period of time without making it really boring, when you come down to, is it interesting enough when it's such a short period of time?
Man, that's fascinating. You just everything that you talked about. It really amazing on Blind Eye and this new project that you have. Martha Burns has been my guest on my podcast, Blind Eye. It's a novel that she had wrote and it came out in 2022. You can find it at Barnes and Noble, indiebound.org, and Amazon. It's gotten great reviews as we talked about earlier in the episode. Martha, I want to thank you for coming on my podcast, and I hope you would come back when you get the next novel out. I want to talk to you
Oh,
about
I
that.
will, and I'll listen to your podcast now. I really thank you so much. It's really a lot of fun to talk about my writing.